Okay, so thank you so much for those of you who've joined us again at Chat Physics for another author Q&A. We're really excited to have Tom Sherrington here today, and we're going to be talking about Rosenshine's principles in action and the learning rainforest. So there's plenty to talk about today. I'm hoping to really get into those kind of nitty-gritty ideas that Tom talks about in his books, to share those with you. And if you are joining us on YouTube Live and you do have any questions, do pop those to us. And if we can't answer those today, maybe we could get round to them on Twitter a little bit later on, so you guys get the chance to take part too. So I'm going to jump straight in. This is obviously scheduled to have about 45 minutes, so we can talk today, and then any further questions we can take later. So first of all, Tom, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, I'm really honoured to be invited. I love being invited to physics things.
That's what we like to hear. I mean, even though we are Chat Physics, you know, even though we are hoping to support physics teachers, getting into the teaching sort of pedagogy side of things as well is just so important. But we're absolutely thrilled to have you here. So I'll kick off. Let's talk about Rosenshine's principles in action first. It's obviously gained quite a lot of traction, and it's something that's always been spoken about on Twitter. But what was it that really sort of like prompted your initial inspiration to do the book on Rosenshine's principles in action?
Well, the book arose because I'd started doing talks at places like Research Ed and invited to schools, and I had a kind of thing going around evidence-informed teaching and trying to suggest to people that there was an evidence base around memory and learning and various other things which would support them. And then people would say, well, what's the simplest way to get into this? And because of promoting on Twitter from people like Oliver Caviglioli, who I know I work with all the time, seeing the Rosenshine principles, I actually found this was a really good way into people saying, well, look, this guy Rosenshine, who I'd never heard of until, about 5 years ago, had summarized quite a lot of ideas into one paper. It's really neat. And I was doing a talk about that at a Research Ed event, and someone said, the way I explained it, he was saying, yeah, it'd be quite good to kind of capture some of what you said in the short pamphlet that people could have. And the publisher said that. So they suggested that a short pamphlet was kind of how they put it, would be useful to sort of flesh out the document. So that's what we did. And then I had no idea it would be quite so popular, but it turned out to be.
I think it's always the same with things like that, isn't it? You know, it starts from just a small idea and putting things together that people really need to talk about and want to talk about. And then it really can go through from just a suggestion to something that's become, talked about through thousands of people from what I know on Twitter. And I believe as well, it's regularly shared in schools, part of CPD. It's become a real sort of significant factor that we sort of develop through at school. So it's great to see such significant movement come from that. So you start off right at the beginning, actually, by sort of summarizing into 4 strands. And on looking at this, is there some kind of intention there of sort of limiting the amount of difficult information that people have got to gather? Was that kind of part of that? Because it's something that we talk about later on that we really should be doing to support schema for students. So I was wondering if that was kind of the intention for teachers too.
Yeah, I mean, and it came literally from me trying to sort of condense the ideas into a presentable period. So if you're doing a Research Ed, you have 40 minutes, which flies by. So I was thinking, well, I've 10 principles, and 10 things is a lot to go through. So I was thinking, well, so I was sort of surveying the thing. I was thinking, well, I find myself flicking through this thing anyway. So you do daily review and weekly and monthly review. They're sort of talking about the same types of things, but just in quite a different way. So those go together. Questioning and checking for understanding. Well, that's just questioning, and so that goes together. And it just made it easier to sort of just capture the things. And then sequencing concepts in small steps leads into kind of how you model those steps and then scaffold them. And that seemed to work. And then practice, obviously. So I just thought, this for me is just, I'll organize it like that just for my talk. So then it became a way of actually writing about them as well in the book. So it wasn't really, I'm thinking about teachers as such, but it turned out to be kind of an easier way to communicate things because you can remember them much more easily.
Yeah.
In fact, even just now, if I was trying to sort of recite Rosenshine's principles, that's my organizing principle is those 4 strands. It helps me think through it yeah, so they did come from needing to communicate a lot of ideas in a condensed period of time.
Yeah.
So it had a nice sort of spin-off.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it starts it off really nicely because, you know, it sets the scene for the idea that we're looking at realistically how we're going to build the schema to help the learning to, you know, to scaffold as we go through. And I just thought actually opening it like this is probably one of the smartest ways to start a book like this. Now, so we were thinking about what I was wondering is how well do you think teachers, maybe particularly in science, are buying into the idea that basic material, because you talked about the experiential learning and the idea that basic material needs to be in place, so basic understanding has to be in place in order for experiential learning to actually be successful for them. So how well do you think teachers are buying into that? Is it the kind of discussion that you see that goes up a lot on Twitter?
Well, I'm not sure about. I mean, Twitter is a funny place for discussions because people come at it from so different angles, and there's every type of perspective. So I suppose my main perspective is when I'm actually talking to teachers that I meet in real life, because I feel like that's more real, you know, to me. I do that all the time. So I think there's a really interesting debate here. So one of the things that Rosenshine alludes to is that sometimes, and it's important to say sometimes, it's you sort of pre-teach ideas so that when you see something, you know what's going to happen. So, for example, if I was going to talk to you about momentum conservation and sort of enact some collisions with some trolleys and some objects, and you might actually just do some stuff first and say, have a look at this. Can you see? Isn't this weird? How like if these two things hit each other, they rebound, or if that one is static, they sort of seem to swap places. And right, let's see if we can explain that. So we talk about momentum and some stuff. And so you might actually want to see the thing that you're talking about first, and then start defining some of the things that you've observed, and then go back to it again with a fresh look. So you do it in a sequence. And it's that type of thing where if I haven't seen it before, I don't even know what you mean when you say momentum, so I have to get some sense of it from an experiential point of view first. However, you then have to go back to it with the language. So if I'm going to describe what I've seen, I now need to have language to describe that and talk about position and velocity and the concept of momentum before I can realistically explain what I've observed. So they're kind of preloading the conceptual idea before I can attempt to explain something helps. So you go in sort of cycles. Have a look at this. Right, now let's see if we can explain it. Right, now can you use this terminology? And I think you need to think through what that means. So do students need to have felt, seen, touched, observed a phenomenon before you even introduce the language? Or is it more practical to sort of tell people about something and get them to have a conceptual framework and then observe it so that it makes sense? And I think that depends on the nature of the prior learning and you know the flow of the idea. So so there is, but what Rosenshine I think is hinting at there is that just going straight in and sort of hands-on with stuff when you don't have the language to explain what you're seeing can sometimes be very, very limiting, because I'm just sort of always in the dark there. So he's sort of, I think, encouraging people to try to formulate a conceptual framework with appropriate language and so on to tool students up to then explain the stuff they do observe.
Absolutely. And I think you touched on the idea of the prior learning there. And sometimes it's really difficult to know if our sort of full cohort sat in front of us have the same experience as each other, which we don't always. And sometimes we do have scenarios where the content we're teaching might lend itself very well to, you know, life experience, which some students just don't have. So actually introducing some of those ideas can really build that sort of, like, you know, fill the gaps in the prior learning that some might have. And I think a lot of people have also spoken about how sometimes, I know there was a period of time in teaching where it was very much, here's a method, go and work it out for yourself. And I think a lot of people kind of called it discovery learning. I don't know if it always really was that, but I think this kind of goes the same way as well. You know, you can sort of embed the wrong learning skills here. You can give students experiences that they think they're supposed to notice, whereas actually we're not really honing in on the important content of what we're actually trying to learn. Is that something you've experienced a lot throughout your teaching career?
Definitely. Yeah, and really, really definitely. I mean, sometimes you need to set something up so that, so for example, I'm sort of thinking of something like a kicking wire experiment, where you've got this phenomenon where you're trying to show students that electricity, that there's a motor effect, that putting a current carrying conductor in a magnetic field experiences a force. But it depends on how you set it up. But if you're not careful, you can set it up so the effect kind of is small, and the students are expecting it to sort of like fly off. And because it's actually a small effect, they're sort of disappointed, and they're thinking, what is that? You know. But if you set it up correctly, you're saying, so like, why would this wire move? It's just a magnet. And it's just, look, magnet doing stuff over here as a magnet. And here's, look, a current, and the bulb comes on and there's a current. And look, you know, look what happens to the wire when I move it up, and it starts moving. Can you see? And like the fact that it's moving at all, is really kind of, whoa, it moved. And you have to set that up. You have to set it up so the fact that it moved at all is phenomenal.
Absolutely.
Not the disappointment that it didn't have this sort of huge, sort of big wow thing. So that to me is, you need to know the subject there. You need to know your sort of setup, and you need to be clear about setting the scene so that it's not a physics example, but a kind of analogy I often use when I'm doing this is, imagine going to the British Museum and seeing the Rosetta Stone and not knowing what it was before. You just go, oh, okay, there's like some tablet thing with some writing on it. But if you're told in advance about the Rosetta Stone and how it helped people sort of decode hieroglyphics, and you go, whoa, that is the actual real Rosetta Stone. Whoa, it's really weird. Like, it's a totally awesome thing. And that to me is all about getting the sequence right of what you teach first, the setting, getting the concepts kind of in students' heads so they can appreciate what they're seeing with a kind of with that kind of correct sort of inquiring mind.
Yeah, I would completely agree there. And I remember doing the, the classic sort of like bin bag capacitor, just to set it up literally out of scraps so they can see what happens. You know, you end up sort of like punching those holes through the plastic bag. But I think it was one of those where, you know, you explain it to the students and they really are expecting, you know, I think they think capacitors and things like science fiction sort of films where it's going to be like, you know, like vaulting across the room, and they expected that. And actually the capacitor bin bag is disappointing when that's what you're comparing it to, but does, you know, really does show a good concept. I think the other one, though, on the flip side of that, is just something like the interference of light, like literally creating dark fringes. Now that in itself, if you just showed somebody, you know, they don't really sort of pick up on it, and they're like, okay, there's bright fringes. But actually, no, what I'm trying to show you here is that there's dark fringes, and it's the idea of that interference. And I think that can look just, you know, it's confusing, and students can just look at it and be like, well, fine. But actually, when they realize what it is, when they realize that light really has interfered there, you know, it can be quite mind-blowing, even though it literally does look like a few dots on the screen. So yeah, completely agree with what you say. 100% about knowing the subject and knowing that prior experience to lead on from. Yeah, absolutely. So, oh, sorry, were you going to say?
No, I mean, as you're talking about things, I'm just thinking of some, you know, the sort of things that you enjoy doing as a teacher and the reason why you enjoy them. Sometimes it's when, you know, you get to be the one who shows something or demonstrates something. And I just got so many sort of moments where I'm thinking that was so great, because I remember very early in my career working in a school, we had this fantastic kind of gym wall at the end of a field. And it was just one of the best places I've ever been to measure the speed of sound with a sort of bang echo method, because you've got a really like couple of really like bricks and just bang them together. And you could get the students using trundle wheels to measure the distance, and then use a fairly simple equation to work out, you know, the distance and the bang echo, and get a rhythm, and sort of teach them this idea that the sound is traveling back and forwards, and so we can sort of create a longer in sort of a distance to measure the time. And then when you did when the result came, we got a really good answer, like really close to what we were expecting. And the fact that they knew what the speed of sound was already, and they kind of didn't really appreciate what we're doing until they measured it and they calculated it was true. They're going, whoa, and they had this feeling of like really satisfying that just with us, with a stop clock and some bricks, could measure the speed of sound.
Yeah,
they thought that was pretty awesome, and I think the kind of real power of that came through seeing it to the end, and the number being the thing that they predicted it ought to be, but they didn't really believe we'd ever get anywhere close to it. So that to me was neat. It doesn't always work everywhere because you have to have the kind of quite a clean distance and not too many other walls for the sound to echo off. But that was good.
Yeah, I think I've done it in 2 different scenarios, and one, like you say, it was so crisp and we had such a good distance on it, worked fantastically. And the other one, it was I think a class actually got let out while we were in the middle of it, and we never quite got to the end, and we never quite got that sort of, I don't know, I think for the students it's almost like a eureka moment. It's like, oh, we just did science, and we know we did science because we've got something like real to compare it to. Similar when we do Planck's constant in year 12, like coming up with that value, it probably wouldn't mean anything to them unless they'd realize the significance of the value. But yeah, absolutely fantastic to get those moments with the students. So
and things like so there are experiments which you do because they kind of they're satisfying and they're sort of predictable trends. And the other, I mean, I feel like I'm sort of slightly ruining the question flow here, but I mean, for me, one of the things I think is interesting as a science teacher, which leads in, is that, and this is hotly debated, is the purpose of an experiment. And I think you have to be clear about the reason. So something I think is interesting to do, for example, is say burning food, because then you, and seeing that you can heat a test tube of water and measure the temperature rise. And it's got a few things in there. So you're measuring temperature rise, so it's like a measurement. But the fact is you can't really control the variable of the material that you're burning. And there's so many variables that it can't control. So it's a really terrible experiment for comparing the amount of energy in the food.
Yeah.
So if you set it up to be, look, we're going to see how much is in a peanut and how much is a crisp, it's a terrible experiment because you can't really control that. But you can discuss that, and also you can talk about it from the perspective of why it's hard to compare. So if you do it explicitly to talk about variables and why why those results might be satisfying to compare them, but why we can't trust that, I think that's quite a good learning experience. But you need to do that with that intentionality. Plus, you're just also cementing the idea that there is energy in food, and you can release it, and you can. But so some people think, why would you do an experiment which inherently doesn't work? And I just think, well, only because you know that it won't, and it helps students sort of solve a problem with that.
All right.
But I mean, that's just, some people would never touch that because they'd be thinking, oh, I just confused my students. But it depends on what your students have done before, and the other types of experiments they've done leading up to that.
Yeah. And I think so long as it's really, like you said, being really explicit about what can we learn from this. And, I always say to students who they always come to us, electricity practicals never work. Okay, well, they do. But, they get I think they get so used to, especially lower down the school, a circuit's not working. And they don't really get taught how to swap change until we've got something working, because notoriously got problems with circuits, but actually sitting there until they build something that works and they can work with it. But I think I always say to the students, what you're learning here is how to cope with trying to investigate real investigations, because when you go off later on and you've got fantastic kit to work with that you can almost, that's is so reliable and you can pretty much presume is working, well, what about when it doesn't? You're going to need to solve this. You're going to need to ask yourself the questions. What can I change? What can I check? And I just think school is the perfect place to do that, because things won't work. Things will go wrong. And, realistically, I think school science experiments are about being imperfect because of so much that they can learn from those. So, I think I always try to lead students into that idea that this is kind of the purpose.
Well, I think electricity lessons are, the sort of thing you need to sort of spiral around. Like you need to do some basic ones, and everyone should be able to sort of see that, and series and parallel, and then different predictions. But there are some issues there. So, for example, because of internal resistance and other real life factors, people say, no, keep adding bulbs in parallel, they'll stay as bright, but of course they don't. And so sometimes students don't believe you. So you're saying, you see, it's wrong to say, like the one that you've done in theory and the one that they have to do in the exam, that they're all the same brightness.
Yeah.
Because there are, but in reality they're not. So sometimes you have to be careful about putting something in which undermines the message you were trying to give, because it doesn't support that. The real life is complicated. But when you've got students with enough kind of confidence and knowledge to make circuits that do this and do that, can you make a circuit that is controlled with one switch and does this or that? I think that's quite good. And one of my favorite things to do with students with that sort of thing was to say, like, once you've shown me you can do this, this, and this, see if you can make a circuit to do this, this, and this, and there, or even design, literally very open-endedly, sort of design a circuit that you think is doing something interesting, and then we'll come around and look at it, and then they would say, right, this is our circuit, we can control this switch and that makes, and they would have had some ownership of that, and it wasn't just do everything exactly like I told them. But that was at the end point, after they'd succeeded in establishing the basic understanding. I could go on about this forever. I mean, one of the things I find interesting about the circuits is the topology of the circuit relative to the diagrams, and some students don't even find that like baffling. That you always see it as rectangles with square corners, and the fact that you could, all those parts of a circuit are really in real life just the same place. Yeah, but you've drawn them neatly with lines to make it look neat. But they're not really. You can put all those things in a different place and they would be exactly the same, because topologically they're identical. And students can't relate that because they just want it to make it look exactly like the page. And absolutely, that thing is brilliant. I think, well, you're learning a lot from this about just visual, real world circuit versus diagram circuit. Anyway, so that's all very interesting. You have to sort of model that quite explicitly and say, can you see why this is the same? And you can see why this one's not.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like what you were saying there about how you sort of come up with the idea of, can you get a circuit to do this, and design your own that's got its own sort of purpose to it. And I think a lot of people have sort of given this whole discovery learning and this sort of student-led learning a bad rep, but realistically that's just a fantastic opportunity to go away and say, okay, you've learned some stuff, now can you apply it? Can you investigate with that? Because I think really, even though, memory is important, building those really core concepts, those sort of key knowledge points, if you like, is so important. But being able to go away and use them is just next level. It's just a natural progression from learning, learning the topology, like you said. So
this is where, for me, this debate goes a little bit wrong. So which type of learners would benefit from that approach? Well, ones with high, confident students with more knowledge. Would you do that approach with students who are still struggling to just make a circuit work at all? No. It's not all things to all people. So you have to have sort of thresholds where everyone needs to get to this point, but when you're past it, you can go off, which is where the kind of learning rainforest kind of stuff happens in that book. I start talking about the possibilities and what is possible. And the truth is that some students are capable of quite a lot of exploratory learning, but because they've got the knowledge to do that. But so you've got to be not sort of right off that possibility and say, well, I'll never do that, when it would actually be possible for students to do it. Yeah. And I'm someone who, when I was 14, when I did my physics O level, that's how old I am. I did O level physics.
You'd never know.
We had 3 weeks doing projects which we could choose, and some people were sort of doing like projectiles and trying to. There used to be this great TV show called The Great Egg Race, and some people were doing that. I'm trying to fling an egg and catch it, and other people were doing. Someone was trying to make a car that floated on a bed of magnets, and like a kind of monorail type thing. And my friend and I were trying to break the rules of physics by trying to make a motor which drove a generator, which then drove the motor, to sort of work out. We knew it wouldn't work, but we were trying to work out at what point it didn't, or whether it just. And so we spent ages sort of trying to sort of fiddle around with motors and generators, and the teacher was happy for us to do that because it was just interesting, and we were really getting into that. To me, was a really powerful learning experience. But we kind of were going to do well at O level. So he wasn't worried about us passing, kind of thing. But still, so for me, you have to be cautious about the types of experience you're giving, but be open to the possibility that there's more beyond if you've got students who are ready for it.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is a good place to pick up actually on the sort of worked examples and exemplars, because, you know, we talk a lot about having to sort of build students up and give them sort of really good foundations on which they can apply the skills, the things that they've been learning. So when it comes to worked examples, there's been a lot of sort of agreement on the sort of I do, we do, you do, or very slight variations on that. But I think, you know, I've seen a lot in teacher trainees over the past couple of years. They find it really tough to draw the line between enough worked examples and too many, and in particular when you've got really mixed classes. So if you were talking to trainees or any sort of like early career teachers who were perhaps unsure about how to manage worked examples with mixed classes, trying to get the sort of build right, what kind of advice might you have for them?
The main thing I do is to say, you know, whenever you're designing a question set, just have way more examples than you might think you need. And so, and look at before you set them to the class, look at the progression. So look at the increasing in difficulty and make sure that there's progression in difficulty. And there's lots of easy ones. So let's say you've got a student who's at the lower end of your ability range or attainment range. They need to practice, just say, you know, basic, you know, velocity. Let's say it's, you know, feedback equation or something. The basic kind of speed, distance, time. Can they just do that with some level of confidence and fluency? So they're really developing a really strong concept of speed is distance divided by time and rearranging that. Then if you might be other students then going into sort of reading things off graphs and interpreting graphs, worded questions, then those follow next, and then it might be then introducing acceleration or whatever you're doing. So you just have the progression is going on, but there's enough. The student who just needs to keep practicing can. Mm-hmm. Who can go on can. Now, of course, you're getting a bit of divergence there, but then you bring people back together and you talk about the issues, but they're all on the same, literally on the same page. They're on the same set of tools. You don't say, guys, you just do them and you just do them, and you only need to worry about this. You're all trying to work your way through these practice questions and be able to understand this concept. But it's a bit like, it's a bit like, I always think it's like a bit like mixed ability piano lessons or something. You know, we're all talking about piano, we're all playing it, but some of you are playing harder pieces than others because you're ready to, and some of you aren't. So it's just the reality. It's not like we're trying to hold you back. You can keep going. Like as soon as you finish those questions, there's higher ones to practice. So I would say just make sure in very practical terms, you just imagine the weaker student you have. If they can't, how much practice will they need? Well, lots more, like 5, 10, 15 practice questions. Make it feel sort of slightly repetitive even.
Yeah.
And then have the habit of saying to students, like if you think you're getting 4 or 5 right in a row, brilliant, move up to the next level and then do them and then do them. And students understand the idea of working through the levels of a game, and everyone gets that. Students are very familiar with that. And you start at the beginning, but you don't have to do every single one of the basic questions before you move on to the next level. So that's the thing. For some students, they just don't need that. They can move up. Yeah. And it does come to sourcing lots of questions. That's the thing. You have to look up lots of questions and have them ready, even if you don't use them.
Absolutely. And I think it's quite a nice idea also to, you know, give it away to sort of like independent progression. Like if you are confident that we're getting these right, let's push yourself a little bit further. And I think the independence is something that we probably do a little bit more of in schools. And it's probably been, you know, it's been a long time coming, I think, having a bit more independent study. So giving away a little bit of independence in the lesson, even on simple tasks like that, really can start to open that up too.
And I think like with... Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's fine. No, go ahead.
Well, it's like, so one of the things in Rosenshine's principles, he talks about an 80% success rate. So, and that's a nominal figure. I think the figure is just a kind of, it comes from a couple of studies where that was the figure that came out. But it's a kind of rough idea that the optimum success rate is high. So not like 50%. So if you have the same sort of questions for everyone in a class and you just say, well, they get harder, it gets harder much more quickly for some children than for others. So what they have, they're not getting an 80% success rate. They do the easy ones and then they're stuck because they haven't consolidated enough lower down. So those students, to build their success rate up, and that leads to their mindset about this is something I can do, and also just that learning and making sure they're fluent with the maths or the concept. Other students, if the success rate is too high, they're being understretched. So if they can just sort of keep going, and it's just like, oh, but this is easy, their success rate is too high. And so you need to up the challenge for them. So they need to progress up. So even looking at Rosenshine's principles as a kind of guide, to get 80% success rate kind of on average and kind of for students, you need to have variable difficulty questions and be pushing students to sort of push up the difficulty ladder. And so a trainee teacher, I'd say, study the difficulty range that you've got on offer and kind of understand it. And questions are never wasted. I have actually talked to teachers who said, well, but if I give them all the questions now, I'll have wasted them. You think, well, you won't have, you could use them again, but also, what's the alternative? The alternative, you've got half your class finding it too easy or half them finding it too hard. And that it's the kind of using more questions is the answer.
Absolutely. And you gain the feedback that you need to decide where to go, but it's sort of having that evidence and having that practice there. Sticking on the subject of questions, we talk about probing questions. So, really pushing the thoughts out to students. I like to think as well that it's kind of facilitating their thought process to sort of make those developments. Do you think, in your experience, that probing questions perhaps get a little bit overlooked due to time pressures? Is that something you think you might have seen happen?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I always find this interesting. I think it takes a bit of confidence, because I think the reality in a classroom is that you do feel time pressure and you do have this sort of notional sense of pace. And when you have moments of pause and focusing on one student, the kind of audience effect around one student can feel people worry about that. And then making sure everyone else is engaging with that. So there's lots of reasons why people probe less than they could, and less than they would if that student was on their own. So if I was just talking to you on your own, I'd say, okay, interesting. Now what about this and what about that? And I would probe much further. But what about everyone else? So I've got to have this thing of saying, right, okay, we've got to create the culture where one person's probe exchange is like the material for others to check their understanding. So you need to weave into, right, okay, really, really interesting exchange with Jenny. So Mohammed, what do you think about what Jinny was saying? Do you agree with her explanation? And that needs to be the norm, like that's expected. So when I'm talking to you, the other students are anticipating that I could ask them to check their understanding of what you're saying. So there's an investment. And definitely you just get deeper kind of into the material. I saw a student recently, well, it wasn't that recent, but it's just a for instance that's come to my head there, of a student who was saying to me that she was explaining diffusion. So this is really for chemistry A level rather than physics, but it's a similar idea. She was saying, well, the gas moves from a high concentration to a low concentration. And I could have just been really happy with that answer and said, yeah, well done, brilliant, and someone else. But I probed, so I was saying, that's right, but explain how that happens from a particle point of view. So how does it move from high concentration? And she had no idea how to explain it. She was saying, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of starts off here and it comes there, but why? And she couldn't really get into this idea of the particles having collisions and that kind of randomness. She couldn't articulate that phenomenon at all. So the probe told me that actually she didn't really understand the phrase and its origin. She just had learnt the phrase. And that's why it's so important. So checking for understanding saves you time in the long run, and probing questions is the way that you're doing it. You're finding out. So I think probing questioning is great. The other reason sometimes people don't do it is because they're not entirely sure what to say next. So it does come with confidence and experience and knowing the subject. You've got better confidence about what to ask. It's things like with numbers, anything with calculations. It's things like knowing whether it's a good answer or not. I love this with physics and units. Sometimes people come up with ludicrously big numbers for quantities that should be sort of, 10 to the minus 12 something. And they go, well, how could it be? How could it be big? How could it be that big? And some units are crazy big, like Teslas, are huge. But so you if someone had 1,000 Tesla magnet, you go, oh my God, that's gigantic. They don't realize that. So you probe sort of getting them a sense of the numbers, or whether or not that's a plausible answer. And that comes from experience of knowing the territory. So I think probing is really key, and definitely people shortcut it because they think, get on. And this is a decision point in a lesson. Let's say I've got 10 students. Do I ask them all a bit and I get a bit from each of them so they've all been involved? Or do I probe with, say, 2 or 3 and get deeper with each one? And I always think the probe with deeper with each one is better, because the others are thinking, because you might ask them. And you flush out more kind of ideas to think about for everybody by probing within the same time it would have taken you to involve everyone giving their shallow bit of the answer.
Yeah.
That's the kind of balance you're striking.
Yeah, definitely. But I think, setting up classes to expect that kind of environment with questioning, it probably is quite tricky initially. It's probably, if you're a trainee or an early careers teacher, it might be a little bit daunting to do. But with some practice, you can create this really good sort of debate and discussion group. And, what I always find fascinating as well, which happens way more often than I would usually admit, but the amount of stuff kids know about space that I don't even know, and they're kind of feeding into each other and getting really excited about it. And they'll turn around and go, is that right? And I'm like, sure, probably, like, it's not really my domain, but it was so nice to see you getting excited about it and even challenging each other on it. They'll turn around to each other and be like, is that right? And just sitting back and watching that sort of discussion develop and probing each other, the environment's just such a great one to have in a classroom. I think it's something that could be sorely missing if it's something that you don't really dare to develop. So in my opinion, really
I think so. So you've got to balance sort of consolidation and confidence building with that probing and what would happen if and what would happen there. And so that students are ready to ask themselves that question. How do I know what I'm supposed to know? I used to love this. I mean, we used to laugh about it when I was at university. We used to get, like, in our first year exam, I remember that we used to get these questions, which we used to invent questions as a sort of parodies of these questions, because there'd be questions like, if you're on the moon and it's a Tuesday, how far, what is the wavelength that you'll need to, cook an egg in Moscow, something like that? And you'd be going, what are you talking about? Well, that's how it felt. Like, it felt like totally random information. But the real questions were things like, how big a telescope would you need to read the newspaper from the moon? And it would be like, well, you have to think about the distance, the wavelength, the dish size, the kind of resolution. And actually, you could say, well, imagine it's that far. And actually, you could work out that answer. But it was the confidence that if we've been asked the question, it means it must be possible to answer it. Yeah. And knowing good questions to ask at the right pitch point for a student to push them on, rather than just make them totally confused. I do think that's useful. And so preparing some of those questions and getting ready with those and having a sort of armory of good questions which probe this and probe that is good. You're not just making stuff up off the hoof, which can sometimes lead you down into a blind alley of sort of confusion. You've got to be ready for the types of situation. But yeah, I do think that's probing questioning should be something which people do, and developing the courage and confidence to do it. One of my favorite things in teaching physics was when students would say things like, but what like we're doing gravity and gravitational fields at A-level or something, would say, but what would happen if you like flew through the sun? Okay, it's not really ever going to happen, is it? We're going to fly through the sun, but what would happen? I mean, so many other things would happen in real life before we got there, but you're going to have to think, let's humour him. He means from sort of gravitational perspective. So you're kind of, because he's asked, you're thinking, Is this going to benefit everyone? Is this a bit indulgent?
Yeah.
I just say, you know what? Tell you what, let's talk about this at the end of the lesson.
Yeah.
Sometimes we think, well, I'm actually not quite sure. So let me come back to you next time. I'm going to nail this one, but you have to go away and think about it.
Yeah.
And things like that. But if the students ask you a question like that, it's because they're genuinely thinking, what would happen? Because if the sun's this big, what would happen if and they have to like they deserve an answer. If you just brush them
Yeah.
away, you've killed that bit of curiosity there. But you might not
Yes.
be able
Yeah.
to give them a really good answer on the spur of the moment.
Yeah. And even if it's sort of, I'm quite happy to admit that there's an awful lot of things that I don't know. So if I don't know, it's great to say sort of like, I don't know, what do you think? I mean, let's think about what we do know. Let's think about what other information we need. And again, that can generate a really good discussion that goes along those sort of skills of, can we work out what we would need to find out to sort of make a conclusion about this? And, getting the kids thinking about things like that. But again, great discussion points, which can be missing from lessons, certainly. I actually think this is a really good point to just switch over to a little bit about a little bit from the Learning Rainforest. So we spoke a little bit about where did I want to go with this one? We spoke a little bit about memory and how that's sort of really important about that. And my question here is, what are your thoughts on those who are concerned that this whole memory building thing lacks a little bit in the sort of holistic education? Now, again, chat physics being mostly on Twitter, this is where I tend to see most of the arguments, and I know you'll be able to draw a lot more on in-person discussions, but there seems to be sort of two real groups of let's build an awful lot of knowledge versus let's have some kind of holistic education. But surely there is an overlap there, which, we should be aiming for. Is this something you encounter much? And if so, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of like a huge debate in itself. I sometimes feel like things are pitched against each other slightly falsely.
Uh-huh.
But I think we're all in the business of trying to do the right thing. And sometimes someone's idea of doing the right thing means, look, I think if I've got the student a really better grade at GCSE, which is the current system we have, I have done the best for that student, and I can't wish away the exam system now. I might want it to be different, but it isn't different. And right now, the system we're in is where students get value and credit and sort of progression points for getting GCSE. So if I care about this student, and I really do, I really need them to pass this exam. And my principles, my value system might say, oh, it's all nonsense and we should be more holistic and there should be fewer exams and there shouldn't be this and we should value practical work and why can't they do a project?
Yeah.
But the truth is that's not the reality now, and I can't change that. So I think sometimes we sometimes mix up debates about what we'd like in the ideal world with the reality we're in today. And then students who have doors closed to them because they didn't do as well as they could have because they weren't taught in a sharp enough way to pass that test, maybe, are disadvantaged. And I do feel like if we say that teachers matter, we also have to accept that means we have to do a good job, and we also have to trust that we can be better at that. And so I feel like it's a complicated picture. But when I set out the stuff in the Learning Rainforest, I'm sort of saying, well, there's a science and there's a research base around effective teaching in terms of memory and learning and retrieval practice and that side of things, and instructional teaching. There's also a value system about saying there are some experiences which make a good education, which are true whether or not there are exams or not. So, for example, if I take the long-term view and say year 7 to 13 or year 7 to 11 in science or physics, should the students ever have the opportunity to design an experiment and see what happens and explore their own idea, or research a discovery or a scientist that they're interested in and presented to the class, which they chose, or showcase their knowledge on a topic in any way they like with a website or a video, or I'd say, well, yeah, across the whole time. So if I accept that, surely at some point some of that independence should come in. I go, well, okay, so when would that happen then? So when would be the best place for that bit to happen in the whole curriculum? So if you think it should happen, it has to happen somewhere. So then you have to make a choice and say, well, let's put it here, here, and there. And that gives flavour to the whole experience.
Yeah.
And I think if you do that, by the time the students are in year 11, they're more motivated. They've had a rich range of experiences. And they also know how to knock the socks off some revision, some really hard study skill-based questions, which they can do in April and May before their exam, and walk into that exam hall brimming with confidence, knowing their stuff, and bam, ready to nail it. And it's not a choice. So so for me, I think you can have it all. I think you can be incredibly demanding of students in terms of study and making sure they really learn stuff, as well as having given them some fabulous experiences which are quite personally rewarding, and some big insights into some of the big questions about the kind of ethics and big questions about personal choices in the human side of science. I just think that's all possible. So you need to kind of see them as, it's all about how you weave it together, not should we have this in or not, or is it all good or all bad?
Yeah, and it's like you said, it's about thinking about the now and the how things are being done, and sort of working the very best we have within those restrictions. You know, we are restricted by how the exam's working at the moment, for better or for worse, but there's still the opportunity to build around it and pad it out with these experiences. And I think with, you know, timetabling restraints and time pressures, this can be forgotten quite a lot. So yeah, certainly something I would like to see more of. I hope I provide along the way, but yeah, I would absolutely agree with
something else. I think though, sometimes, I mean, I think there are people who disagree with me on this vehemently, but I actually don't think exams are bad for kids. I mean, sometimes you've got sort of teachers sort of saying, oh, look, are we feeling resilient today and stuff? And you're thinking, look, it's just an exam. As a teacher, you can create a culture where the students are up for it, and you prepare them in a way which they are ready for it. And of course, it's a bit stressful, but then that gives them some tools. And students now who are in year 13, who haven't done the exams, are suddenly thinking, God, you know, they're a bit kind of, they're lacking match fitness. You know, that's part of the issue. But I saw more than that, though. I saw my children go through exams. And I would say, like, without any question, the fact they had to really study for their GCSEs. My son didn't take his A-level exams. He didn't have to because of the COVID. But at GCSE, both of them, I saw them having to face the fact that, right, now this is it now. I really need to master this stuff because I have to take an exam in this. And now I really need to get on top of it. So I've been to the lessons. I've had some interesting discussions. But now I need to nail it. And they had to work hard to kind of crack through right now. And both of them, like, my daughter got really switched on to chemistry when she did her GCSE revision in a way she never did before. Because suddenly she was going, oh my God, it makes so much sense to me now. Like, she's at A-level, like, because of her revision at GCSE. It's like, it's so interesting. And she was going, oh God, did you know this? And he was dropping because she had to study that hard. So I've seen my own children sort of benefit. They weren't exactly jumping for joy and going, oh, thanks, Mum and Dad. Of course they weren't. But the fact that they got through it and they struggled a bit, and then I think it did them really a power of good. And that is a bit of my perspective. I'm not one of those people that sort of are kind of like, oh, got exams, horror. I think students are capable of more than we give them credit for.
Yeah, I think so too. I don't know about you, but I always really enjoyed exams at school. I don't know if that's really weird, but I always kind of enjoyed the pressure of like trying to sort of, you know, beat your own sort of like personal targets. Like, how well can I do? How much can I, you know, how well can I perform? And some students have that, and I think some students actually just find it overwhelming, certainly. But I think we can do a lot to build them up, like you said, and sort of creating that sort of like, I don't know if it's competitive because it's mostly against yourself realistically, but yeah, I think creating the right environment for exams is hugely important and supportive as we go through. I don't know how you found, like with teaching, let's say physics A level, my story every year, when I get, I don't know, so let's say between the end of year 12 and the beginning of year 13, there's always a really significant amount of them who are seriously questioning their life choice at choosing A-level physics. But I always like to tell them that as they move through year 13, they're going to be building on the year 12 stuff, and they're going to wonder why on earth they ever thought that SUVAT was more than a simple equation, because when they first do SUVAT, there's suddenly more variables, there's so many assumptions, and reading those, interpreting the questions with the correct assumptions and making sure you're sorting out your horizontal and vertical, it's really overwhelming at first. But then, they sort of do a little bit of motion in year 13, I don't know, for example, circular motion, and all of a sudden SUVAT is an absolute walk in the park. And it's trying to explain that once you get past, I always think it's sort of getting to the harder part. Once you get to the harder part, and once you start exploring that, the foundations kind of build themselves in, because you're using them so regularly and you're sort of visiting more than you've ever gone over before, and things start dropping into place. And I'd say 9 times out of 10, your student will come back to you, I don't know, maybe around February, March time, going, yeah, this is actually starting to click into place now. Is that something you found, or am I just...
I think that's true. And I think in a more general sense, I feel like as a teacher, you grow a confidence yourself in knowing that's okay. Like when electricity is a classic example, like you're never really going to truly conceptualize this, because it's actually just beyond conceiving. It's just outside our realm. It's not visible. It's imagined, and we can see the outcome of it all, but you can't physically see it. So we all have a concept of what we mean by charge and potential difference, which we're trying to make a sort of analogous models for, and that's natural. So it's sort of inherently confusing and will always be. So you kind of learn to tolerate that. And with SUVAT, I think it's beautiful the way it links. And when students are doing A-level, and especially since a lot of them do maths, they learn calculus, and you start seeing rate of change and how acceleration and velocity, rate is a kind of, because they do it in maths as well, and that kind of rate of change of velocity. And then you got those things like energy. When you see v squared equals u squared plus 2as is really an energy equation, even though you can derive it from the other ones. And all of that, there's a logic to it. And I do think when you're teaching it, it's really important to always connect it to the simplest thing and the kind of the everydayness of it, and not just do it through through the formulas directly all the time, even though they're useful to kind of make sure you're getting the answers right. It's making sure people understand it at a kind of concrete level of this is what happens, and because otherwise you get sort of misconceptions quickly. You have to try to visualize the scenario and what's happening. So really connecting the equations and the kind of abstraction to stuff they can visualize. But I found that hugely rewarding, and I think students have too. You make parallel fields when you do fields, and then you do another set of fields, and you see similar things that can happen here. That's one of the coolest things, that whole analogy between attractive gravitational fields and electric fields. You can see radial fields, they have these similar properties. Isn't that interesting? And you're like, I get it. It's like, it's good. That to me is some of the beautiful things in science. It really is great how that all works.
Yeah, absolutely. We recently did sort of gravitational fields and went through the laws, the equations and everything. So first thing they did when they talked about electric fields, I was like, brilliant, tell me what the equation is that relates this, that and the other. And they were like, well, obviously we don't know. I was like, well, I actually think you could work this one out. So let's think about what we know. And it's so true. Just bringing together those links they can make obviously really supports them. But leads them really well into working towards their exams and explore it in their own way. Absolutely. Now, we are pushing on a little bit of time, but I'd really like to ask this one, if that's okay. So there's a part in Rosenshines where you link to elaborative interrogation, so as a sort of questioning method. And what I was thinking is, in sort of like long-term curricular planning, if we're going to ensure that students have that sort of fluent recall of facts first, how is that best embedded when you've got things like timetable constraints? So if you're going to elaborate on something and you really need them to have those factual recall moments, quite a lot of the time we jump from sort of one topic to the next. And when we curriculum plan, sometimes we don't get our whole curriculum done in one go. It tends to be ongoing and flexible. So for people who are perhaps contributing to a curriculum or looking at the change long term, do you have any advice for sort of embedding ways to use elaborative interrogation, that kind of questioning, sort of, I guess, building up, that means we're not going to miss out because our curriculum's not that finished product? That might be quite a complex one, but it's something I've been thinking a lot about recently because, you know, with sort of developing our curriculum and going forwards, all of a sudden we're missing those vital bits that we should have done first. And I think it can be a real challenge for people, especially sort of leading a department.
Yeah, I think you have to be, you know, you have to be kind of on your feet a little bit with this, like in terms of, it depends on the topic sequence. It's you can't really get like the perfect sequence of ideas. It's a bit like I was trying to use this analogy recently, where you kind of look, when you look back over, like when you're climbing a mountain, you look back over what you've looked at so far, and you go, "Oh wow, that's where we were." And that from there, remember when we were there, we thought we were high, but now we're here. We can see all of that in this new perspective. And Mark McCourt, who talks about this in terms of maths education. So sometimes something as simple as, well, let's say, for example, like the wave equation, you know, where the frequency times the wavelength is the velocity. And you might learn that. But later on, when you apply that to, you know, something that's like a high level concept, and you're talking about sort of the Doppler effect or some other thing, or wave particle equation, and you're starting to see that in terms of space expanding and all sorts of other things. You think, oh wow, so that equation, the reason why the speed of light is the speed of light is because it's the actual maximum speed in the universe, and it's a whole other, the speed of light is no longer the speed of light. Light travels at the fastest anything can travel in the universe, and it's like, oh wow, that's so amazing. So you suddenly understand the speed of light is not that's why the speed of light is a fundamental thing, because it's limited by our. So you suddenly see that something you've previously understood in this way in a different way. Now, of course, say GCSE, the concepts are slightly simpler. So you just have to have this sort of sense of like, we're going to do topic A, B, and C, which may seem disconnected, and we might even do them in a different order because of equipment and stuff. And then we're going to take stock and say, right, let's have a look at how all that what knits together. So when you're planning, you have to plan moments when it would be a good time to look back over what you've done so far to see how it all knits up. So can you see how the energy comes in here? Can you see how the wave concept comes in here? And it wasn't evident at the time, and we might not have taught it then, but now we can do it because we've got the tools. And that is the kind of curriculum overview you need to see when the stock take moments might be. And they won't be neat. They won't be sort of like, we do this and it all build and it all build. Sometimes it is a bit disjointed because you've got to cover a number of different ideas, but then it kind of weaves together. That's my kind of very broad view of it. In the detail of the planning of that, it does come to sort of topic sequences and sort of things like synoptic tests that, you know, review a whole bunch of knowledge at once. And the main thing is this: you need to tool students up to study. And I still feel this is one of the biggest weaknesses in our system. The teachers assume far too much responsibility for all of this relative to the students. And it's partly because they don't trust it can be done. And so they're not demanding enough. And so that means you have to have textbooks, revision guides, online tools that the students can learn to use with real skill. And it does mean things, reading. Like, you know, I can see it on the screen here. I didn't know this was there. Right behind me, my physics. This is my physics textbook. It's the ID. That's sort of almost like it's deliberately placed, but it wasn't meant to be.
We believe you.
It's like, if a student has that textbook, you can say to them, next week, guys, we are going to do stuff about, I don't know, fundamental particles. We're going to learn about leptons and hadrons. Read the chapter because it's quite readable. It is. Yeah. And then I want you to come and tell me what you think, you know, what. And some students can come in and they will say, there's, well, and they've read it because the book explains it really well. And then you start the lesson, not as, right, let me give you my PowerPoint slides and tell you stuff. The students have learned to engage with information and you're testing that they can. Yeah. you don't learn to do that in year 13. You learn to do that starting much younger, and you get better and better at it. So I just think we need to make sure that students are learning to read about science, learning to self-quiz. That's why the elaborative interrogation comes in. So if I've got a knowledge organizer, let's say we're talking about the Suvat equations, do you know them? How do I know? Well, because I've got some questions and I can see if I can get them right, and I can check my answers, and I can do it all by myself. And I feel like we need to be really conscious about when we're teaching students and teaching them and testing them. This is something you can do at home. This is something you can test yourself with. And if you're really keen to succeed, which you should be, study, do loads of practice. And all of that is about culture and habits. Like the habit, it just happens all the time. There's no nonsense routine. You can't switch that on like in January of year 11 or year 13 as like in an intervention. The habit for that level of intensive study and self-checking has got to be built up from the beginning.
Yeah.
So that's my message on that.
I was literally talking to a maths teacher the other day, and I was having a real grump about homework. I kind of hate the idea of homework. I understand the concept of it, but I just think it's done in such the wrong way. It ends up being a tick box exercise. It ends up being something that students complete rather than use for success. And actually, do we do it very well to create people who are actually learning, or are they just rushing through a task so that they don't get a tick against their name, And in my mind, it'd be great to do more work on homework being about, developing the independence of their own sort of self-study. And to me, that would be a really good way to go about it. And I think there would certainly be problems with that. You've got lots of different students that would need lots of different support. Some would be more willing than others. But I think rather than having this idea of, go away and finish a graph and complete this exercise, maybe actually, let's develop you as learners, and let's actually have a really rich homework program in place to allow that to escalate throughout your career at school. And it goes back to what you were saying earlier about having the ability to go away and read and to create a presentation, because if that was broken down and embedded throughout a curriculum, you could do some fantastic projects and presentation work and, self-research. So it's certainly something that I'd be interested in.
I think it's the way to go. I mean, like, one of the things I learned, I've referred to this on a couple of blog posts and in the Learning Rainforest book, is when I first started teaching, my first teaching job was in the sixth form college, where the whole 2-year A level was broken down into 42. We should like that because it was from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The life to the universe is 42, but there were 42 units, and like unit 1. Okay, guys, welcome to physics. Like unit 1, and here's the guide, a 1-page A4 guide, sometimes on both sides. Give it to every student, and what does it say? It says, okay, you will need to know the definition of this, this, and this. The equation, these units, and you'll be able to answer questions like this. So your task is read these pages, write the diagram down, do the definitions, and that's what you do. So you give them the guide, and then the next week you say, right, let's show me your notes. Like, this is week 1 of A level. Week 1 of A level there's nothing to kind of worry about, because there's the textbook, there's the guide. Go and do exactly what it says. Students come in, of course, like 5 of them haven't done it. They didn't believe you meant it. So you go, I really meant it. Look at everyone else has done it. Get up to speed. Crack the whip a bit. By the time you're into week 10, there's not a student not doing it. They know it matters. They do it all the time, and they learn to access their textbook, to produce notes. And so you've got these groups of students who are coming into your lesson with notes they have made that are good. And then you don't have to worry about presenting them all the stuff. You can start saying, right, let's have a look at some questions then. And it's all about problem solving, questions, practical, because the note giving is done by the students. And that, to me, is a great thing. If you think I'm spending all my time making all these PowerPoints, well, what are the students doing then? It's one of the most useful things they can do on their own, by guiding them to make their notes themselves. And that to me seems a bit of a lost art. So a bit backwards me slightly. Why have we gone backwards where we've got teachers doing all the note making? Students have rubbish textbooks and don't seem to think they need to read them. And we're all on the back foot. I want to take everyone back to 1987 and show them how how it's done.
I think that would be a great idea. We could probably do with some leadership on that. It'd be absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
So we've I would like to try to do a book draw. So I would like anybody who is listening today to drop their name into the comments section to be in with a chance of winning a book. And I will hopefully be doing a live draw if we can manage to get it done nice and quickly. And while I get that sorted, Tom, is there anything else that you would like to talk about regarding either book or anything else we haven't mentioned today?
Oh, wow. Well, no, I mean, I'm just really thrilled that people have read Rosenshine's Principles. If I'm actually honest, the book I feel most strongly about is The Learning Rainforest, because it's more holistic and it's got more, the instructional teaching that is superbly captured by Rosenshine is part of a richer matrix of ideas. And I think it's important to say that there's a, teaching gives you that freedom to do those things. And I'd say as a teacher, physics is a great subject for expressing that. But yeah, I mean, that was to say, so giving students those chances. I'm sort of thinking people, it may be that there aren't that people are not are going to watch this. I find when I do these events, most people dial in later and watch it later. So are we going to be overwhelmed by people coming in? But even if we do it later on the YouTube comments, I can give people books and stuff when they respond to that. So I'll be more than happy to do that.
That's fab. So I've got a few names that I'm going to be typing up. So if there's anything that you'd like to talk about, I think there was actually somebody who had a question. Somebody has asked, could you recommend any best physics books for beginners? So I would assume they are people probably learning physics rather than teaching, but maybe you could talk a little bit about some ideas for both to help.
Well, what books for people learning to teach physics, or just generally?
I think a little bit of both. There may be books to help people learning physics, and then maybe some books for people who are teaching physics as well.
Wow, I mean, there are lots of really good books about physics. I mean, lots of physics textbooks. I mean, I think some of them are really good, but it depends on what the level you're teaching at. I think Adam Boxer's new book about science is fantastic. It's very forensic about. It's funny because he doesn't so much go into the sort of practicals and that type of thing and those wraparound things that I've been talking about. But he's really just absolutely awesome on explaining in lessons and how you craft a really good explanation, how you sequence some concepts so the students really get it. That's absolutely fantastic. And there's a really good book about misconceptions in science, which I think Adam was involved in, him and some other authors. And those things are really good to read. And I turn to my shelf here and look at all my exciting physics books that I have. This is one of my favorite books. 7 Brief Lessons on Physics, Carlo Rovelli. And Carlo Rovelli is a superstar. And this is also another excellent book. This is Brian Cox and Jeff Forshaw, Why Does E equal MC squared? That is just absolutely fantastic. And it's a really interesting sort of exploration of some of the kind of, I don't know, I just think it takes you through some of those concepts incredibly thoroughly, and he makes you think conceptually about space and time in a way which you may not otherwise see it. And it's obviously written for a sort of popular audience. This is a superb book. Ben Rogers. So The Big Ideas in Physics and How to Teach Them by Ben Rogers. This is absolutely epically good. It's just lovely. It's got some really good examples in it, explored in real detail, etc.
You're doing us a real favour there because we've got that one coming up soon.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, that's great. I mean, yeah. So I mean, it's actually remembering them is hard, but just turning to my shelf and seeing what I actually have on my shelf, those are the sorts of books I feel like I would recommend. Yeah. So I won't say too much more than that. That'll do, won't it? I mean, I think go to the Stephen Hawking end of things, but let's just leave it there. This is another book, Forces of Nature, Brian Cox and Andrew Cohen. I think Brian Cox's books are good because he does have this sort of popular appeal, but actually when you read the actual books, it's really very good. They've got a kind of I don't know, there's a kind of depth to them which I feel makes the kind of some of the school science have a richer context.
Yeah.
Especially some of the sort of social and ethical questions, but also the fundamental ideas about time, space, how the scale of the universe, all these sorts of things, the likelihood of quantum mechanics and what it kind of means in terms of our kind of able to understanding of it. Carlo Rovelli is also excellent on that. His book about time and understanding how time is a kind of illusion that we have of things moving because of kind of energy reasons, but actually it's a construct in a way. And so it gets the idea that there was a time when there was no time. And so all that is kind of mind-blowing and fascinating.
Yeah, I would completely agree. As you can see, I kind of mirror quite a few of these books. So if anybody out there is listening, I would highly recommend some of the same books. Carlo Rovelli, honestly, one of my absolute favourites. Got a few up there. So I've got 2 more questions, if you don't mind, Tom. They're just from the people who are listening.
Go for it.
First one is from Dominic, who says, how do you manage students diverging? So I think this was coming back from where we were talking about the kind of worked examples and having plenty for different people to work on at their own pace. How do you manage the students diverging and then bringing them back?
Yeah, it's interesting. So it's actually in our book on the walkthroughs, we have this idea called thresholds and pathways. And it's a bit like... I always think the analogy is say we've got a mixed ability group of walkers with different levels of fitness, but we're all going on a hike. We're climbing that mountain. How would you organise that? Well, you can't just make everyone go at the same pace, because for some people it's not demanding enough. If it's too fast for some people, they get left behind, and if it's not interesting enough for the people, they can't go ahead. So you would set up a path. You'd say, okay, we're going to get to this point here, and I'm going to go with these guys because they need my help, and they're going to come with me. But you guys, you can go off and practice more independently. And when you get to the kind of the threshold, you kind of know what to do next. And then we say, okay, we all get to the threshold point, and we say, okay, let's see where we are, everybody. And you sort of bring everyone back together, and you get people to share their experience so far. What have you learned? What are you doing? Questions, and you're questioning to the higher attaining students is more probing. And to the students that are just been with you and following through more guided, you're sort of consolidating. And then you just say, right, so what we're going to do now is, and we introduce the next idea. And that's how you have to do it. You have to have these sort of moments of like slightly diverging lessons and then back together to consolidate. So the task design has got to be you've got to have that in mind, which is where those tiered problem sets came in that we talked about earlier. Sometimes you just, and that's really what it comes down to, just different levels of practice and more sort of extended independence for students who aren't necessarily going to interact with you constantly. What I don't think you can get away with is just letting the weaker students just flounder, because I'm sorry, guys, today I'm focusing on the higher end guys, and you just need to just sort of suffer for half an hour. I never think that's acceptable. So you always have to make sure those students might be, I'm going to teach you guys some sort of really more subtle concepts. You guys are going to practice in a way which is definitely doable for them. So very sort of straightforward consolidatory practice, which is what they need in order to get up with the others later on. Mm-hmm. And you might say, well, aren't they losing out because you're not teaching them those things? And you say, well, you can't do everything. You're sort of picking your battles. Today, in this lesson, that's what I'm doing. Other lessons, I might focus more on them and push them along. And I do think you have to sort of be realistic and pragmatic about it. Yeah. So thresholds and pathways is my model for that. Threshold meaning you all got to get through that threshold. And if you can't do it on your own, I'm going to help you. But if you can do it on your own, here's the trajectory for your next steps to take.
Yeah, brilliant. I always find it. I was quite enjoy that point where the ones that have kind of got to the threshold and have sat there and gone, oh, right, I'm there, I can do it. I actually like that as quite a nice little opening to start having a discussion with them about how things go further, like those probing questions, because then anybody who finishes up slightly behind them can kind of come in and join in with that. But there's still time for those who are not quite there yet to carry on with the practice. And, quite a deep discussion at that point. It can be a way of ensuring that you are still challenging those who are quite capable, but without taking anything away from those who need that time to sit and practice. So I think there's lots of different ways to manage this. Now, it's getting on a little bit, so I'm going to attempt to draw this book draw live. So let's see. Wonder if this is working.
I can see a random name picker.
Oh, that's fab. It's just come up. That's brilliant. Okay, so let's do this. Let's see who's won. And the winner, if you could DM us at Chat Physics on Twitter, we can get in touch with you to arrange the actual book itself.
That is great. Michael Kerslake, you are the winner.
Fantastic. Okay, so we have our winner for today. So if you would like to DM us at Chat Physics, we can talk to you about getting that arranged for you. I just want to thank everybody who's joined us today. We really have gone on a bit, but Tom, it's been fantastic talking to you. You've got so much knowledge, so much experience that the conversation was really flowing. I hope everybody enjoyed it. If you've got any comments or you want to ask any questions, please don't hesitate to message or DM us on Twitter at Chat Physics, and I'm sure we can facilitate a little bit of further discussion. So thanks to everyone at home. Tom, thank you so much. And everybody have a wonderful evening. And don't forget to chat physics. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.